All right, so then just to wrap it up, I wanted to ask about kind of an intersectional approach. I know, Ananya, you mentioned when we were talking about sexual harassment, how these issues disproportionately affect certain populations, and you said especially women of color. So I just wanted to ask what your thoughts are about how the county should approach intersectionality when it comes to problems like racism and sexism, and how we should balance that intersectional approach with productively solving all of these very serious problems with our school district.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think at the core, it actually goes back to our op-ed and what Nate, Matt, and I talked about, which is this idea of a very vocal minority so much shaping the work that our school system does, and which results in new policies, programs, initiatives, not necessarily representing the broader student voice and community voice. So what ends up happening is we instate these programs and then we realize 25, 30 years down the line that they haven't worked, and the data shows that they haven't worked. So I think it's really important at the fundamental level to start with when, as students, we advocate, we really have to think about how we can effectively encompass the population of students who we might not necessarily individually represent, but it's our obligation to ensure that our advocacy keeps in mind the perspectives of all people in our community, especially those who may not be able to come to the table for various reasons. So I believe that intersectional approach really begins there in terms of the student and community engagement piece. In terms of a system-wide piece, I think it's very, very important as well for racial equity and social justice to be integrated into every single decision that's made as a school system. And I know Montgomery County more broadly, one thing that they started last year, the county council started, was a racial equity and social justice initiative, which literally obligates our district to think about every single policy, program, initiative from a social justice perspective, which I think is very valuable and critical to moving our society forward in a progressive in a proactive manner rather than a reactive manner. So I'd hope that our school system follows suit and continues to think about, for example, when we're doing COVID-19 recovery planning, I really hope the school system does think about students who don't have access to food at home, who don't have transportation to school except for the school bus. So, you know, our buses need to be super sanitary and super clean, because the unfortunate reality is the disparities that we see in this pandemic and in this time are going to only be exacerbated by the school system reopening if we don't think about it from a conscious perspective, like racial equity, social justice perspective, and really consider every single population that's going to be impacted. So proactive measures and ensuring that we consider our commitment, our commitment to this progress that we speak of is only real when we think about every single issue proactively from that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I guess a quick follow-up to that is, when we think about measures like the anti-racist system audit that's going to be happening, I guess, over this upcoming school year, how should intersectionality be factored into stuff like that when we think about racism as it interacts with sexism and or homophobia or transphobia or ableism? So should all these things combine in one audit? Should they all be separate? How do we do that? Anyone can take it. It'll be our last question.
I felt like I already talked a lot, but I'll take this one too. So I think the reality of the situation is, when we think about creating a more anti-racist system and society, we have to, like I mentioned in my earlier response, we have to think about every single problem from an anti-racist perspective. So we really do have to think about, for example, how a racist system causes the disproportionate criminalization of Black males. And we also have to think about how a racist system causes the disproportionate rate of sexual assault and harassment on young women of color, right? So I think that every single problem, if we really look at our system as a whole and each individual piece, we're bound to find that there's intersectionality naturally. I think that right now, I'm not a research expert or anything, but when we think about doing research, you want to start with one issue or one perspective that you want to explore, and allow that perspective to organically drive you to these other problems that manifest as a result of that initial driving perspective or in addition to that. So I think it would be a little bit, in such a massive system, I think it would be a little bit difficult to specifically outline the ways we might address sexism and homophobia and ableism as it intersects with racism. But if we do this exploration and research and understanding correctly, and we develop solutions correctly, they'll also take into account these other problems, if that makes sense. I think it's very right to start from the anti-racist perspective, because that's a core issue we face in our society today, and that's the purpose of this particular exploration. But it would be remiss to not think about these other problems and how they differ for different racial ethnic groups as well through this analysis, if that makes any sense. But
It definitely does. I actually really like that take of letting it organically fuel an intersectional approach. That makes a lot of sense. Those are all of our questions that we had about your article and general proceedings going forward. Do you all want to add anything about your perspectives being on the board, student advocacy, any of that, or are y'all content with this so far?
I mean, something that I always think about is that the big challenge of MCPS, in fact, I'd say it's the existential crisis of MCPS, is that we're considered a really, really good school system. And the question is, were we just considered a good school system because for a long time, Montgomery County was really affluent and really white, and those students were going to do well no matter what? Or are we a good school system because we can extend those same really good outcomes to the students who increasingly come to us with poverty, with need, who don't look like what this county initially looked like, what it was initially zoned for? And I think that that is the challenge that the county faces and is trudging through right now. Um, can we provide good outcomes to poor Black and brown students, just like we did for white students for decades? And I think the answer to that is an open question, and it's what we're dealing with right now.
Well said. And Ananya, well said to your last question as well. As Rebecca Smondrowski says, ditto.